Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Us, a show dedicated to bringing real help to real couples. I'm your host, Melanie Studley.
What's up, guys? My name is Seth Studley. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and together we are high-performance marriage coaches.
We are cutting through the bullcrap and creating a movement of happy, healthy, badass couples all over the world.
Let's go!
This episode contains explicit language that is not very good for tiny ears. So if you're with your kids, put your headphones on. Take it away, Mom and Dad. It's time for the show. Let's go.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Seth. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, along with my wonderful wife, Melanie, who's a high-performance marriage coach. And today we have some amazing authors on hand. Shaunti Feldhahn, which I've seen before and we can talk about, and then Dr. Michael Sytsma, and they have written the book, Secrets of Sex and Marriage. Welcome, guys. How's it going?
Thanks for having us on.
Good. Yeah, wonderful. I know we tried before, but there's some scheduling stuff, but here we are, and we're going to dive in and help some couples today. But first, why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience so they can get familiar with you?
Okay, well, if you want me to, do you mind if I just jump in first?
Ladies first.
All right. So, my background is a little interesting for people who are talking about relationships because I'm not a therapist like Dr. Mike over here. I'm actually a researcher, a social researcher, and an analyst. I actually used to work on Wall Street. That's my background.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so today I take that skill set, I guess, and use it in a completely different way to try to dig out and investigate the little things that really make a big difference in people's relationships.
Awesome. We actually saw you in person years ago. We're out in the Seattle area, and when you were touring for your book, For Men Only, For Women Only, out at Mars Hill Church, which is now, of course, gone.
Obliterated
and not a thing. Yeah. I do remember that. I believe I was in grad school then, and I saw this Harvard person coming out has a new book about marriage. Yeah, let's go check it out. So we actually did see you and your work then, which I enjoyed it and still do.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's
that
like
was a
surreal.
fun event, despite everything that happened. That was a really fun event.
Yeah,
it was good. The books were great. So thank you for those.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Mike, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Yes. So my early training was as an addictions therapist and then trained as a pastor. Fell in love with doing kind of marriage work. Kept going back and getting training in therapy because Pastor Mike didn't know how to answer a lot of the questions that was being brought to me. Mm-hmm. And started building intimate marriages in 98, focusing on caring for marriages. I started working with sex addicts in 90. So when I began working with marriages, it was easy to transition into working with sexual issues. Went on and got my PhD, specializing in marital sex therapy in 2004, and have been doing that ever since. Fell in love with doing the research piece during my dissertation on sexual desire discrepancy. And so this gave me an opportunity to pick that back up and keep working on it.
Awesome.
Our introduction is basically a long way of saying we're total nerds.
Yeah.
All this stuff.
Well, we can
You're in
nerd.
good company because we're the same.
We can nerd out together. A lot of my work was based in research and the scientific literature and stuff like that. So if we want to talk that way, we can, or if we, just want to talk as normal people do, we can do that as well. But one thing I was thinking about your work, Dr. Mike, was when we're Christians, so we've been in the church for a long time, and when we were going through some really hard stuff, which turned into the genesis of this entire podcast, we actually had a biblical counselor who was a pastor and who was also trained as a licensed clinician. And I count that as a very, very good blessing, because oftentimes people say, oh, well, yeah, I can talk to my pastor about marital stuff, but and this is no disrespect, they're only just a pastor. They don't have the clinical training or the clinical background or the knowledge of a bunch of different modalities and stuff that we use. So could you talk that? I know this is not in the notes anywhere, but could you just speak to that a minute? Like, okay, the difference between a pastoral counselor and then a clinically trained pastoral counselor.
Well, it sounds like you said, you had somebody who blended both. my pastoral training really emphasized pastoral counseling because that's part of who I am and what I loved. But I remember vividly Tim and Michelle coming to see me and sitting across from Pastor Mike, and they said, "We've got a meeting with the divorce attorney at 3:30, and we thought we'd stop here first." And I went home to my wife and said, "I don't know what to do with that. I can turn scripture around and say, 'Thou shalt not divorce,' because I've been taught to do that. But I'm listening to this couple, and I wouldn't want to be married to either of them either." And there's got to be answers in scripture someplace. Nobody's taught me how to get them out. And that's when I kept going and pursuing the clinical training and being trained, as you know, in systems theory, for example, which gives you a whole different way of viewing the couple and what's going on, or to be trained in what we know as empirically supported treatment models. The 4 models we have in our field that we have proven over and over again, these models cure couples. And as a pastor, I wasn't trained in those. The training a pastor gets is rich and is good, but the training a therapist gets, especially a systemic therapist gets in working with these kinds of issues, somebody that has both, like what you had to work with, that's my background as well. So I think that's the best of both worlds, especially when you integrate them. But when you're seeking somebody for help, you really, you do want somebody who has that type of training.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned systems therapy. That was my training, which of course goes into family of origin. And when I began to learn about this stuff about 15 years ago, I just started putting these pieces together. And then when we sit with clients and go, "Oh, wait a minute, some traits from your mom and dad and your grandma and grandpa and aunties and uncles and all that," you actually bring that to this face-to-face relationship with your spouse. And oftentimes, sitting with clients and therapy clients and coaching clients, just that you see these light bulbs go off of like, "Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I can change this." And it's so, it feels good when we're able to normalize a lot of that stuff, which we couldn't name earlier, but to give a face and a name and a voice to it, that's very impactful in someone's healing for sure. So yes, yay to systems for sure.
Very much so. My original training was not in that, and we have proven that individual therapy models tend to create more divorce than healing. And so I intentionally pursued the systems training because we have the research that shows it works. So
can I ask another question about that? And I don't know how to ask it because it's sort of formulating as you're talking. Excuse me. I keep thinking, so you started out with the pastoral lens and then you added the therapeutic lens on top of that. What can you explain sort of the way that they interact with one another as you work with clients? Like, what do you pull from, like, in the biblical realm that you're not able to draw from? Does that make sense?
It does. And, there are plenty of books and articles that are written on how to do that integration kind of piece. But for me, it happens dynamically in the office. So a couple that comes in and uses faith language, we use that faith language. And it resonates for them because that's the language that we're using. For the couples that come in who say, "We don't believe in any of that," or "We come from a different faith background, but we believe you can help us," the same principles are at play. What works. I will use different language for it. Or we have to figure out what resonates in their stories and what stories from their past. Somebody who comes in with a strong Judeo-Christian worldview has some rich stories in their past that we can tap into, and that gives meaning to them. Somebody who doesn't have that, we may need to tap into other stories. If they ask for things like prayer, we can do that. But that's not generally a part of what I do. And for me, the whole point of why I do what I do is about personal discipleship. The reason I do marriage therapy is nobody reveals our unhealthiness and unholiness like a spouse. The reason I work with sex therapy is the power that's in it to reveal what's going on at the core of this relationship. It reveals our selfishness, and it reveals our demanding, and it reveals the way we play victim when we don't need to. And it allows us to shift it. Well, those principles are the same whether the couple is a faith-based couple or not. The language shifts and what their vision is. And if they're Judeo-Christian, the vision can be who God is calling you to be. the vision is exhibiting Christ in your marriage. If they're not faith-based, we have to find a different vision language. We have to find something else that they're fighting for. Does that kind of help?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Beautiful.
A lot of that resonates with me and our clients too. And I love that you said, that's kind of paraphrasing, marriage. Well, I think of it as how the Bible speaks about, going through the crucible, and all the impurities kind of being burned off and the best kind of rises, and that's what you end up with. And boy, if this marriage right here hasn't been a crucible, then I don't even know what is, which is cool, because that is a tool that God can use to, hey, I gave you this person to bring out the best in you, but I hate it. This sucks. I don't want to do it. But it's like, okay, discipline is not pleasant at the time, but then later it is, right? And that made me think a lot of that. And I had another question going back to systems thinking, but Dr. Corey Allen, which you guys may know him. We're all kind of in the same field.
I just got off the phone with him.
Oh,
he's awesome.
He's great.
That's so cool.
We've done some collaborations together in the past, but he talks about how we do sex is how we do life, right? And that made me think of his
Which
quote.
I think is a Schnarch quote.
Yeah, David Schnarch.
It is. Yep.
Yeah.
And we're both, you could kind of almost say, disciples of that way of thinking. So,
Which makes a lot of sense if we're reserved or only thinking about sex and intimacy. If like, if I orgasm, then that's fine. Whatever to them, and like how we approach it and how we initiate and all that stuff. That's probably how you think of your spouse and your family, even. And
what can I get from you
outside of the bedroom, right?
Yeah.
And we wove that into the book. Chapter 3 is all about vision, helping couples to identify what the vision is. What are they striving toward? Is it that I get my own way, or is it that we work together? Chapter 9 is, to me, really important in the acceptance that you're not going to be who I want you to be. And as couples begin to grow, as you talked, we do reach that point of, wait, you're not here to do everything I want, but that's not what I thought I was signing up for.
Right.
You're supposed to see me as amazing, even when I'm not. And we address that in chapter 9, and then 10 really presenting some of that vision and the richness of it. So all of that is woven in through what we've written in this book as well.
Yeah.
I love that. I want to ask you, Shaunti, as a social researcher, well, number one, I keep thinking, how must you see the world? You must see everything from this social, ooh, she's doing that, or ooh, he's doing that. So that's just me putting that into your brain as if that's how you are. But I want to know a couple different things. But number one, what sort of put marriage specifically into your heart as a social researcher? Why that route?
Well, it actually started with the book that you guys were talking about for Women Only, which was a study of men. The whole thing actually started in a way that I could never have predicted that this would be where I ended up 20 years later, right? But it actually started, believe it or not, because I was writing a novel. And one of the main characters in the novel that I was writing was a man. And I realized I didn't know how to put thoughts in his head. I had to say what my main character was thinking, right? And I'm like, I don't know. What would a guy be thinking? And, he's this good, husband and father, and, he has these issues. And I'm like, I don't know. And so I would just start talking to guy friends. I'd talk to my husband, or we'd be out to dinner with another couple. And I'd be like, okay, here's the scene in the book. What would you be thinking? If this was you?
Whoa.
And this whole thing started because as these men started telling me what they'd actually be thinking, which they could do safely because it wasn't them, it was the character, right? But as I started sharing this, I'm like, seriously? I found myself really shocked by some of the things I was hearing. And as I started doing more of these conversations, really what put me on this path is that I started to realize that what I was hearing, it wasn't just that it was surprising. It was really, really foundational stuff. These things, I would say, how often does, this particular concern come up in your mind or whatever it is?
Mhm.
And they'd be like, oh, I don't know, 2-3 times a day. I'm like, what? Like, I'm thinking 2 or 3 times a month, and so these were these heart feelings, these insecurities and worries and expectations and belief systems, and like a lot of this stuff that now actually that I've done more research, we know that some of it is actually tied to the differences in brain wiring. Like there's all sorts of hormonal differences. There's all sorts of reasons for this.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, all I was seeing was this is really important. And I've been married for 8 years and I had no idea.
Yeah.
And so that's what started that path into research. And it was just this amazing situation where I ended up getting connected with the former chief of survey design at the Census Bureau. And he helped me design this big national survey of men. And that ended up starting us on this path unexpectedly. But yes, I do. I talk to a lot of people now.
That is
hear
so
the inner
cool.
thoughts.
Yeah. That immediately makes me think I totally need to reread that because I read it when you first came out. And I mean, I remember it being very impactful then, but I think 2 things have happened in that span because that's been quite a few years. What year did
20 years?
Yeah, I was going to say
19 years. Yeah.
That's wild. So that came out right before we got married. That's crazy. So like, I remember again, there's so many things that have happened in our society that shape even how I perceived men. For a period, I was like, men are just dumb. They don't forgive me for thinking that way.
I mean, I hear ya.
And it's wild to think about. And now I have 2 sons who are teenagers. So now I think rereading that from a perspective of a mom would be super impactful.
I will tell you that I had the same experience. Being a wife was one thing. And I am a pretty strong personality and pretty opinionated. And I'm like, well, that's just dumb. That's just silly that you would feel that way. Like completely invalidating everything my husband was feeling.
We're kindred spirits.
Anyway. Right. This is a signal that I am not a therapist, right? But anyway, so, kind of like having to come to terms with, oh my gosh, like 87% of men think the same way that Jeff does. And I have 2 choices. Like, I can either go, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or, well, maybe you do. So I need to work with it. But you are so right. When it comes to understanding how that impacts our sons, or for the other way around, dads and daughters, because we've done all sides of the research, there is a completely different motivation that comes in. And I'll give you a perfect example, and it ties into actually the sex book and the sex research that Dr. Mike and I just finished, because one of the things that is a mental switch that's really important to happen if we are going to care about the best interests of our spouse, which I believe we're called to do, as well as our own, but that we're called to look out for their interests. It is really easy to kind of get our back up as a wife or a husband, like it shouldn't be that way. And like for me, for example, to speak really critically to my husband. And, and I've had to work on that because now I know it triggers an insecurity inside of him that I didn't even know was there before. Right. And it's kind of painful. But I kind of think, well, he's a big boy, like he shouldn't feel that way. But doggone it, when I think of my son and having some woman speak to him the way I just spoke to Jeff, no, that girl is not good enough for you. I'm like, holy cow, like there's a totally different perspective. And so as a spouse, especially when we're talking about something as important as intimacy, as a spouse, being willing to attend to that vulnerable place in our spouse's heart and say, yeah, I may not always agree that those feelings should be there, but I need to honor that that's there. And that opens up so much willingness to look into things and learn and try to understand ways that they're just different from you.
I love that, like, learn, understand, whatever, attune, I don't know. What's funny is that it makes me think of actually something Dr. Corey Allen said I was interviewing him for a thing we were doing, and he just sort of threw this out, like, would you want to be married to you? And I was like, oh, geez, Corey. But I was like, no, I wouldn't, because I'm not nice enough. Like, I am judgmental. But we should definitely talk about your book, because we clearly just want to talk to you as people, but we definitely want to share the book. I want to ask a question though first. What was each of your favorite parts of, like, what's your favorite chapter? What are you most proud about in this book that you just want to, like, dote on, I guess?
Well, I know mine, but I'm curious what Dr. Mike is going to say.
Oh, I think you could guess it.
I totally have one.
For me, it's the one that they made me put all the way at the end. It's the theology of it. It's the richness. It's presenting a vision. Keeping sex about the intimacy, about the connection. It's about being a servant, and it's about the incarnational piece, keeping it both about the body and the spirit at the same time, and being rich with both of those. So it's the vision that we're calling people to. It's this grand opportunity that most people have not really developed. They accept something far less. They're fighting for something far less. And the opportunity to say, no, this could be really pretty amazing. To me, that's my favorite part of it. Yeah, which is way not any of the research or anything that I had so much fun doing. But
well, it's so meaningful. And I think, so maybe what you're saying is like the spirituality and the spiritual part of intimacy, right? And a lot of people, or am I reading that correctly in a sense?
That, to me, that is critical as a faith-based individual myself. Mm-hmm. But I spend so much time with my clients helping them to establish vision. What are they really after? Mm-hmm. And many times they have such a stunted view of the power and the potency, the availability of sexual intimacy in their life. Or they've gotten these myths that have shaped it in an unhealthy way. And so the vision that they are actually fighting for is unknowingly destructive, that I need to do for you, or you can't manage you if I don't, or that you want something other than me, or all of these beliefs that are not healthy and not good don't contribute to a rich intimacy. To say, no, let's get you on page with something that is truly mind-blowing and profound, something that allows you to pursue a richness together that goes way beyond your bodies, that you can still be doing when you're in your 90s. So it's more that spirit aspect of it, not just from my faith-based perspective, which obviously I think is best, but but it's helping the couple to establish theirs.
Yeah,
I have to say something about that. This is so interesting, because literally this morning I was just standing at the kitchen sink making my coffee, and I was thinking about this idea. So I just talked about this on a podcast episode the other day, that before we were married, I was addicted to pornography, and not very many women talk about it. It's not something in our culture. And I had this flash.
But it's not uncommon.
Not uncommon at all. Right. And I had this split second thought of when I was struggling with that, I had no idea what healthy intimacy looked like. I had no model, no concept. I remember thinking when I was getting sort of fighting to get free from that addiction, being like, I will be messed up forever. I will never have a normal sex life, a normal, I'll always have these really unhealthy thoughts. I will always be plagued by this. And it just, again, it was this split second thought this morning of how I can't even imagine, kind of like what you're saying, Shaunti, you never imagined that you're, starting to write a novel would turn into the research work that you've done. Never, ever, ever could I have imagined that where we are now, the type of sex life we have, it's healthy, it's spiritually healthy, but it doesn't include any of the things that I thought a sex life would have to include to be exciting, fun, lively, whatever. I mean, it just is it's shocking. So I love that you...
Well, you rewrote the narrative for yourself around that.
Right. And that's a big part of what we were trying to do with this book. The goal was to write something that couples sit down and read out loud to each other and discuss. that they figure out what's going on for them, and whether they come from the background that you're talking about, whether they come from a church background that locked down their sexuality, whether they come from a wounded place. We bring in these unhealthy beliefs about sex that don't serve us well. And to sort through something like this that gives us a grander vision, that resets the narrative and allows us to step in with, I don't even remember which chapter it is on curiosity, or
it's chapter 7, I think.
Yeah,
it's chapter
addresses
7.
some of the directly. I'm guessing what Shaunti's going to pick on here, directly addressing some of the myths that culture has. But so, what was your favorite chapter, Shaunti?
Okay, I have to confess, I have two, but they're for completely different reasons. So the first one is actually the second chapter of the book. Is basically, it's kind of the first like substantive chapter. Like, here's some of the stuff we learned. And it's basically, this is going to sound so bad, but it's basically all that stuff that everybody's curious about. Like, how often do people have sex, and what do they do? And like, all that, I hate to say it, but it's just truly like satisfying curiosity. And really, our editor cracked me up because we originally had some like, I don't remember what it was, but some very formal official title, like the state of our unions, or something. And he's like, that sounds very boring. And he said, what you're really talking about is what are married couples up to in the bedroom, which is not boring.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's actually really helpful. It sounds funny, and it's not just about satisfying curiosity, although, of course, that's what people are curious about. But it's truly, I see so much when I'm out talking to people and doing interviews and doing some of the previous surveys, I see so much tension in people's heart because they have no grid. You know how you were saying that you had no grid for, what was going on. And most people, if you think about it, because this is such a vulnerable, sacred topic, this is the one area of marriage where we usually don't even talk about this part of our marriage with our closest friends. And so we have no like grid for, are we normal? Like, are other people dealing with some of the things we're dealing with? Do other people not want to do that? Like you just feel weird. And so it sounds funny, but I love that chapter, people read it and they go, oh,
right.
Like, we're not weird. Like,
Right. Right.
no matter what we're dealing with, there's somebody else dealing with this too. And so that's that from just a basic standpoint. That just, it makes me happy. But if you don't mind, the chapter that I actually think is the most interesting and like applicable to probably the most couples is where we talk about the fact that we have this myth in our heads from, again, not talking to other real people and really only seeing like how Hollywood presents the sexual process, and realizing that we've been believing this misconception that there's really just one process for the way that desire works. And there's not just one process. And there's like different physiologies that most people don't even know exist. So we can dive into that more specifically if you want to. But that was really from a usefulness standpoint. That applies to the most couples.
Well, what you just said made me think of Dr. Emily Nagoski's work in Come As You Are, and how she talks about brakes and accelerators and like sexual congruency and all this stuff. And oftentimes, like one thing that I learned from that book was, oh, wait a minute, I don't need to, or Melanie doesn't need to throw on all these accelerators, like do this and do this and go, crazy. No, it might be just one simple thing of, hey, take your foot off the brake there, and then we can both go, and both have an experience that is connecting and also pleasurable for both of us. But one thing I wanted to go to what you were talking about on chapter 2, Shaunti, was people asking, okay, are we normal? And we can get into that. But one of the tenets in therapy, out of the zillions, out of the many,
true, though,
yeah, probably
is the normalizing of some behaviors, right? Because oftentimes, Dr. Mike, I'm sure you've had clients this way. They're coming to therapy. Hey, I have all the, I have a healthy relationship, I have a healthy family, but I'm just not happy. And of course, we can go into maybe, different mental health diagnoses there. But the fact of normalizing, we're talking about normalizing the process. I remember early in my therapy career, there was a mom was talking to me and she was feeling some jealousy towards her daughter because her daughter and her husband were having like extra time together. Like, oh, I wish my husband, paid that much attention to me. Because, he was taking her out to ice cream, doing like daddy-daughter dates, like very fun, healthy stuff to have in a daddy-daughter relationship. But she was feeling, am I bad for thinking this? And I was like, no, not at all. You want to be seen, loved, and heard by your husband. And since there's, extra time going to your daughter, you're not getting some of that. So let's talk about that. Let's normalize that. And she was like, oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not selfish. I'm not a jealous, raging mom. Okay. And that was really helpful for her. So let's talk about one of the talking points. Are we normal? Right? A lot of clients come like, okay, we have kids, we're doing our job thing, maybe we have intimacy, we kind of go out and we just like par for the course, but is that normal? And I remember being in church from the church background, and this is not a healthy thing, but the pastor would talk about, hey, normal husbands, normal wives, they have sex X amount of week, and maybe it was basically whenever the man wants it is what he was saying. Right. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
The person who said that shall remain nameless.
He was fairly,
but you might know who it is.
He didn't. There's been,
but might have been a male who was teaching what he wanted.
He should have just been talking to his wife. I don't know, or a counselor.
I think there was a lot of that from the pulpit, actually, which not super healthy, right? But and there were thousands of young married men in that church, right? So we were me being one of them, me getting information. Oh, wait a minute. Biblical healthy Christianity and marriage is like, 2 to 4 times a week. Okay, perfect. Hey, Melanie, what's wrong with us? We're not doing that, And that, I was like, well, wait a minute. That's fairly one-sided, right? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what is normal. Of course, what the research bears out and what you guys see.
Well, and before we should explain, by the way, as we are explaining some of these numbers, that these aren't just like, we didn't just do a Facebook poll, right? Like this was a 3-year, very expensive, nationally representative study with these 2 nationally representative surveys. One, which is, I think, Mike's favorite, of married couples. And we think, Mike, I don't know if you want to explain, we think this is the largest
match pair sample, dyadic data, to use the fancy language. So we're asking both the husband and the wife these questions, and we know who's married to who, even though it's an anonymous survey. So they don't know what each other's answered, but we can ask the husband, what does your wife think about the color blue? And then we can ask the wife what she thinks about the color blue to know how far apart they are. And when that gets down to, when it gets down to sexual things, how often does she have an orgasm? You ask him and you ask her, you can get some really different answers. Right. And so that to have such a huge sample size and to, as Shaunti's saying, to have it nationally representative, which means we paid for the couples to look like the average American based on the 2018 census data. And so it's across faith boundaries. We're not asking people who believe in something to take our survey. We're not going through our own networks, which is self-selecting. So we have this rich data set that, we're really proud of both of those. But I really like the couples, the dyadic one.
So cool. just for our listeners, like this survey. So okay, there are Facebook. This gets on my nerves. There are Facebook surveys. There's Instagram polls of influencers say, hey, yes or no, and like, okay, who did you sample? What is your size? The statistical validity of that is just bonkers out of the window, right? So as being trained in research, I really, really appreciate this. Like on the things, it's like N equals 169.
Right.
Like most people don't know what that means. It's like, oh, that's the number of people in this thing. Here's the statistical validity of it. Here's the percent,
Right.
all that stuff. So I really, really appreciate that. This is not, for our listeners, this is not pop psychology,
all
silliness.
he's trying to
This
say
is real.
he's also a nerd. That's
Well,
all he said
yes,
just now. He's
absolutely.
also a nerd.
Right.
We appreciate very much.
Well,
So it's good data.
Shaunti's been doing this for years. I had 7 doctoral level, PhD level courses in research methodology and statistics and how to put this kind of stuff together. So to have that kind of data is important. And most of my surveys over the past 20 years have been convenient sample. We ask the people who we can get a hold of. And those are good surveys for what they are.
Right.
But this goes miles above that in terms of validity and reliability and all of the things that as nerdy statisticians we want to know.
Love it.
So your question was what? Tell me what your question was again, specifically the statistic you were curious about.
What, based on your guys' findings, what is normal? Of course, with the presumption of, okay, there is no normal, but what did you guys find? And I know that there's some data like, okay, most couples have sex 1 to 2 times a week, some not 1 to 2 times a week. What, if you could just give a quick little synopsis of what you guys found to be normal?
Do you mind if I just jump in?
Please.
Dr. Mike, just okay.
Yep.
So one of the things that was actually really helpful to find out with this matched pair survey, so the one where it's the most accurate because we have both the husband and the wife confirming whatever it was. If you look at that survey, there is this wide range of normal. In fact, when you put it on a pie chart, it's almost like a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. Like it's this very widespread. For example, and this is not good, but we found that 23% of couples fit into a category that sex therapists view as sexless marriages. That they're actually connecting less than once a month. Okay. And there's all sorts of factors in there. There's medical issues and age, the age brackets and all that. But there's all sorts of issues that tended to be more prevalent with that group in their marriage, etc., which points out the importance of us attending to this area of our life when that group tended to have some issues that came up in ways that it just didn't for other people, or certainly not at the same level. But then in the rest of the group, it was basically this, like, again, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, where if you look at people who are connecting somewhere between once a month and once a week, it was about, I can't remember the number, but it was about a quarter. If you look at the people
about
who are
30.
Say it again, Mike.
About 30%, yep.
Yep. And then if you look at the next group, that was sort of like, once a week to 3 times a week. It was another number like that. And then you look at 3 times a week or more, and I think it was like 19% or something, 20%. And then there was that 4% that were the robust everyday people.
Every day or more, yep.
Every day or more. But the interesting thing to me was that if you look at the people who are actually sexually connecting, so setting aside the people who aren't, the average is 1 1/3 times per week. And now Jeff and I were just doing a marriage event this past weekend, and somebody comes up to us afterwards. They're like, could you unpack that third for me?
Right.
Literally what I just thought.
Are you stopping a third of the way through? Like, well, why does that? Like, no, that's just 4 times every 3 weeks.
It's like, a regular family with, 1.5 kids. We're like, well, wait a minute.
Exactly.
That doesn't work.
Exactly. But that's actually really encouraging for people who are running around after kids and who aren't able to maybe connect as often as one or both of them want. And to recognize that the average is 1 1/3 times per week. It's not like 4 times per week, right? Like that's helpful to know.
Yeah.
The other thing that Mike identified Dr. Mike, when you actually gave me this chart, I thought this was one of the most important pieces of data that we got out of the whole study individually. because he crunched the numbers on the dyadic survey, on the match pair survey, in ways that were beyond what my little brain could handle. And he actually identified that both, in most cases, neither spouse is actually getting as much sex as they want. And so I don't know if you wanted to explain that a little bit, Dr. Mike, because that was a big aha moment.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
Well, I found that in my dissertation 20 some years ago, and it was one of those, okay, this is massive and plays a huge role in therapy as a couple comes in and they're typically blaming the other. And we're not having sex enough because of you. And you sit down and start to really ask the question, if it were totally up to you, how often would you? And first off, we find that couples are not near as far apart as what they think they are. The stereotype that Shaunti laughs at is the husband and wife that sits across from me, and I look at her and I say, if it were totally up to you, how often would you like? And the most common answer I get from wives is one to, now this is not in the data, this is in my office, but I'll hear her say 1 to 2 times per week. And I look at the husband and I say, what would you, if it were totally up to you? And he's like 2 to 3 times per week. And I look at him and say, there's not much difference between 2 and 2, but then he looks at her and he says, wait, you want it once or twice a week? How come we're not? And he's realizing she's not getting what she wants either. And that is revolutionary for the couples. That and that's what Shaunti's pointing out, that they're really not as far apart, and neither of them are getting what they would really like. And when they shift to the same side of the table and stop blaming each other for not getting what they want, well, if you were nicer to me, then I'd be more open. Well, that's probably true, but that's not horribly helpful. To get to what is getting in the way of neither of us achieving this vision that we could be reaching for. Now we're partnered together to problem solve the issues that are out here. And it may be that you're hyper-focused in work. It may be that you're a little too critical. It may be some of those very real things, but now we're together problem solving it. That changes everything for a couple. But that requires them talking about what they want openly and honestly and being curious and accepting it when the lower desire spouse says, yeah, I would actually like more than what we're getting. But there's just some barriers in the way.
So that externalizes the problem to a degree. Like, okay, I say 2 to 3 times a week. Melanie says 1 to 2. Well, why aren't we doing it? Oh, it's not because you're, cold and critical, or it's not because I'm not attuning. Oh, it's those darn kids.
Or we haven't prioritized what the context that is required for us to be able to be in a healthy sexual state.
Yeah. So the problem isn't here, it's externalized. Like, okay, now we can brainstorm on, let's have a better kid routine. Let's have, let's turn work off at a certain time. Let's prioritize sex. And that leads me into the question of, what is your guys' opinion on scheduling sex? Any research on that you've come across, or anecdotally or not?
We didn't actually ask those questions, but in terms of scheduling, that's one of the things that I use clinically a lot. And when couples push back on it, we unpack, why are you pushing back? I want it to be spontaneous. How's that working for you? And I tell them, okay, so be spontaneous within that time frame. So you're going to have sex every Wednesday evening. That doesn't mean that it has to be the same way. You guys can still shake it up. And anything that we find important, we prioritize. We're intentional with. If worship is important to us, we're intentional with it. If spending time with our kids and parenting them is important, we carve out time for it. If them being a part of a team and learning how to play ball, because of all that gives, we will rearrange our entire life for that kid to be in soccer. If we say that our sex life is important, why don't we carve out time to sit and connect with each other and do the work of marriage? Why don't we set aside time to play together and set aside time to be intimate together? All of those get important. So I don't know how else to be intentional if we don't do some scheduling.
Well, and I can just say, if I look back, because Jeff and I have been interviewing and surveying people, like we said, for 20 years now, right? And probably it's more than 40,000 men and women now. I have to add it up currently, but it's more than that number.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those interviews are related to marriage. And a lot of the time, intimacy comes up. And a lot of the time, when people are talking about what's causing success or heartache or whatever, the topic of scheduling comes up. And I'll just tell you that I can't think of a time, there probably is one or two, but I can't think of a time in all of those interviews over the last 20 years that I've ever heard a couple say, well, we tried it and it just damaged everything.
Right.
Like, I'm sure that happens occasionally, but just most of what I've heard about that has always been neutral or positive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of one of those things that's like worth a try, and you might find that, wow, like I wish we'd done this before.
Right. And I heard
it has
go ahead.
I was just going to say it has a potential to do damage if we step into it as duty.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because then we're not being playful, we're not being open, we don't really want to connect. I just have one more thing that I have to check off the box. That's not intimate. That's not incarnate sex.
Yeah.
But for couples that say, no, we really want to, and this is a method to get there, yes, it is very powerful.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, Dr. Mike, we plan everything.
Yeah.
If there's a new restaurant in town, I'm going to make reservations. Is that taking out the spontaneity?
To make the meal taste less good?
Right.
I can't believe you planned this.
It's gonna be amazing. And like Shaunti, what you were saying, if there are some, less than stellar planned sexual moments, maybe chalk that up to it wasn't because we scheduled it. It was maybe because I was just, I had a bad day at work and my brain was elsewhere.
Yeah, or sometimes it takes a few tries to get it to work, right?
Yes.
I mean, like riding a bike takes time, learning any skill. And that's the one thing I think is when people start doing that, they say, well, we tried it, I didn't like it. Well, how many times?
How many times did you try it?
Yeah.
One of the couples that Jeff and I interviewed, it was really interesting. The way that Jeff and I did the qualitative research was different because, with Dr. Mike, he has thousands of people that he has guided through this over the years, right? 35,000 hours of therapy.
Wild.
Over the last 3 decades and something, right?
Yeah, I don't like to add it up.
Okay.
That's hard to do when you're only 40. That's impressive.
That's sweet. That was a long time ago, dear.
So Dr. Mike has he has all of this richness of talking to average couples on this topic. And so when Jeff and I were trying to figure out how do we get average couples on this topic, how do we have those interviews? Because normally in any other topic, when we're talking about money or parenting or whatever, I'll randomly stop people in airports and coffee shops and ask questions, but that would get me arrested on this topic, right? But so the way that we got average people, and there's one I'm thinking of in particular when it comes to this scheduling topic, is that we actually said we will do these interviews over Zoom with your camera blacked out and a fake name. Right. So you can see us and you can relate to us, but we have no idea who you are. You can be completely open and honest. And one of the couples, I think they were Wanda and Vision, which cracked me up. One of the couples, with the name they chose, they had actually described that he was a pastor and they had gone through all this stuff with their church. And I think there had been a lot of church transition and they'd had to leave the church and it was really painful and they moved to another state and had to uproot their kids. There's all this stuff. And then in the middle of all of that, I think one of their kids died.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just a terrible, terrible time personally. And yet they described it as being one of the most intimate, close times of their entire marriage where they were coming together rather than pulling apart. And so we're like, can you unpack that for us? Like, what do you attribute that to? And the wife thinks for a minute, and, of course their camera's blacked out, so I can't see her. But there's this pause, and she said, well, one of the things that I did during that season is I knew how important it was for us to stay connected and how easily we could be ripped apart. And so she said, I put this little secret reminder in my phone to initiate intimacy with my husband, because I just don't think about it. Like, she's definitely statistically like some other women stereotypically, but there's reason for the stereotype where it's just not occurring to her in the middle of a busy day. And so she said, I put a reminder in my phone twice a week to be able to initiate and make sure that we have that time if he didn't. And she said, it was one of the most intimate times in our whole marriage. And, they got through it, and here it is, 8 years later or whatever. And she asks her husband, Vision, she says, you didn't know that I did that, did you? And he's like, no, I didn't. You can do that again.
Right.
If you want. But I thought that was really interesting. That was an example where it wasn't even mutually scheduled. It was one person making sure to be intentional because they knew how important it was.
Right.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a great example.
Yeah. And that makes
really
me think,
awesome.
you're truly, as a wife in that scenario, as Wanda, she's really seeing her husband for the full person that he is. Not trying to cherry pick what we want in our spouse. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. There's a lot of power in that, a lot of healing power in that. There's a couple things I want to say before we just let you guys tell everyone where to go.
One second. So I just want to go back to that. This is how we go
we
along.
tap
like
each other under the thing, and we've just been doing this for 10 minutes.
but in that, the intentionality of the wife in that, number one, it's great. And I'm not just saying because it was sexual in nature. It could be anything else, right?
Anything. Correct.
And for guys listening, probably every man listening said, hey, listen up to this. I'll share this podcast with you. Trying to get his wife to do that is the wrong approach, right? I want the men to maybe secretly or not secretly be intentional. How can you love, see, and listen and serve your spouse in that same way? Like, not being stereotypical, but usually men have higher desire. Not in every case, right? And I'm aware of that. But one of the most deepest spiritual, physical, emotional, mental ways that I can connect with Melanie is through intimacy, right? And so if guys out there go, okay, what is the number one way that Melanie, or not Melanie, that wives feel connected, feel seen?
What is that, an N of one? Am I the one? Is that how it works?
The N of one, right? In this
But
study,
it should be for that husband. What you're saying, that's the point. How, and we talk about this in chapter 8, how do we draw our spouse in? My language is seduce, but how do we draw them in? How do we woo them? So you're totally on target in saying to both of them, what can you be intentional with? And he may, for this scenario, he may need to put in his calendar reminders just to wrap his arms around her and tell her, I know life is really difficult right now. I am not going anywhere. We're in this together. I love you. I so appreciate. She may need that affirmation and his strength that he knows we will conquer this. We'll get to the other side of it. And he may just be
reassurance.
If that's what she needs, or she may need him to step in and just look at her and say, babe, go shopping. I'm going to totally clean the house today. You don't know what's going to touch your spouse's heart until you sit down and have that conversation. But then you're right, you have to be intentional, schedule it in, and work to how do I draw them in.
Absolutely.
I love that you use the word woo, because that was like the one word that came to my mind as you were saying that. I was like, it's wooing your wife. Like which is a whole different thing than when people say like put foreplay in your calendar. Like, is that the same thing?
It's pursuit. Pursuit. Yes.
It's living seductively. It's not doing something that's seductive. It's living that way, living in such a way that I am always wooing my spouse, that I'm always being my best with them. And that's what we talk about in that chapter. How do you figure that out? And how do you bring that person to the table all the time?
That's
You know,
amazing.
Not saying, I know I'm not my best, but you should want to have sex with me. Like,
Right.
No.
Because I did something cool right now.
Yeah.
Right?
Or 10 minutes ago. I want listeners to kind of like pause and camp out on that idea that you just said, Dr. Mike. Like living this, like it's almost like, okay, this is the lifestyle. I live a wooing lifestyle towards my spouse. And I'm thinking about, you know, dieting or something. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this for, 90 days. And then after that, I don't know, then it's, cards are off the table or whatnot. But it's like, oh, husbands and wives also live this lifestyle to make it, oh, you interact with your wife, your husband only that way. They know that you're there. You know that they're there and you are wooing them.
Yeah.
The only thing that I will caution though, and I just have to say this if you don't mind. Okay. Back to what was actually my favorite chapter. Which, how we were talking about, like, it doesn't fit the Hollywood myth. Here's the problem. There are so many spouses who do live that way, and they do all the chores and they help with the kids or they do the whatever, like, but it's still like, I was still disappointed tonight. Like I did everything and I'm living that way and I'm a great husband or I'm a great wife and I'm still disappointed or whatever it is that they're feeling. And the only caution that I would have is to recognize, and we didn't get a chance to get into it, but there is a second primary type of desire other than the, oh, I'm thinking about it kind of person who has that sort of initiating desire. There is a second physiology of, and in the book we call it receptive desire, where literally the physiology works in the reverse order. They're not thinking about it and they decide usually to get engaged with their spouse. And assuming it's positive, this is all assuming this is a good relationship and that's a positive, but as their biology starts getting stimulated, then that sense of, ooh, now that I'm feeling that sense of desire that maybe their spouse felt 10 minutes ago.
Right.
And that's the one thing that I see disappointing a lot of maybe the perhaps higher desire spouse is like, but I'm doing all that. I am wooing my spouse. But if that person has receptive desire, they're not necessarily thinking about intimacy. They're just like, oh, that's so nice that he cleaned the toilets.
That is literally you just said my whole life. Like, I don't think, I love like tidying the house, making it clean. I love it even better when he helps me do it. I never connect it with sex. I never am like, oh, he's doing this because. I'm just like, yes, he's finally,
Sweet of him. Exactly. Yeah. And so we do also have to recognize that if we're expecting our spouse to have the same physiology that we do, maybe they do. We found that 10% of couples both had, the wife and the husband both had that initiating kind of feeling of desire for sex and pursuing it. So it's great, but that means 90% had a different pattern. And so that's the one thing that I just want to encourage people is like honor the pattern that both you and your spouse has, rather than feeling like, well, I've done all this stuff, which you should do anyway, right? Like you should love your spouse anyway, but I've done all this stuff and it never works. And I mean, that's a terrible way of thinking about it, but that's kind of what our human nature does, right? And so recognizing that actually they are touched by it, but there is a step of having to activate that sexual desire in them.
Yeah.
And that sort of intentionality of moving towards it without you feeling like, oh, well, I must not be desirable because they don't initiate. And no, they just have a different physiology than you do.
That's brilliant. It makes me think of what Dan Siegel says. Dan Siegel is my nerd boyfriend in my mind. I'm in love with him. And he talks about honor differences, promote linkages, right? Like you really have to honor these differences. Yeah. You're not just putting up with them. You're not just, I could handle it. Like, you're honoring how you're different, and then you're promoting how you can make connections. So, okay, here's what I wanted to say a minute ago. I want you guys to have an opportunity to tell people where they can go to find your work and to get your book, all of those things. But before I want to say that, I want to say this. This is the thing I want to say first. How do I become as cool as you guys? Are you in some club that I'm not in yet? Because I want to be in it. This is ridiculous. You guys, I can't imagine talking to you all day and like doing research. That would just be the coolest thing ever.
We need to form a club. Clearly.
Oh, you said it.
Form a club. Absolutely.
Call me.
100%. You heard it.
Text me. I'm giving you my number after this.
It's called the
For real.
Healthy Married Sex Club.
That would be
right?
amazing.
Based on research.
For real. Yeah.
Right.
Tell everybody where they should go to get your book, to learn more about what you do, like individually, and any services that you do, all of the things. Just let it go.
Dr. Mike, do you want to go first? You're the one who's...
Yeah, the secretsofsexandmarriage.com is the easiest way for them to find us. They'll learn about the book. We have other resources there, things that we couldn't put into the book that go a little bit deeper. If they're looking for help, we've got help. We didn't talk about pain. Sexual pain is just huge. So we've got several articles on addressing sexual pain. And there's links to Shaunti's website, links to my website. Both of us speak. We go around and, do marriage workshop seminars. Then I do therapy here and have a team that does that.
And where are you located?
I'm in Atlanta,
okay.
Just outside of Atlanta in Swanee.
I can tell by your accent. I'm just kidding. It's so thick.
Yes.
Yeah, both actually. I'm in Atlanta too, and the joke is that everybody in Atlanta is from somewhere else.
Funny.
Oh yeah.
Hence the lack of accent. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Shaunti, what is your website and how can people find you?
Well, you can get to it through secretsofsexandmarriage.com, but it's shaunti.com.
Mm-hmm.
And basically there you can see, for example, like, you were talking about this other research project, like that's where I have all the other research data, all that data.
Yeah.
Anyway,
awesome.
The nerd out stuff.
Yeah, I'll go there. I like it. So you guys, the book is Secrets of Sex and Marriage, 8 Surprises That Make All the Difference by Shaunti Feldhahn and Dr. Michael Sytsma. You guys, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I'm sure that this will be helpful to our listeners. Hopefully you get a lot of traffic to your website with questions and stuff because, most married couples want great connection and pleasure, and you guys are helping us do that. So thank you very much.
We might have to have you back several times, or if we start our secret club, we'll just be real friends. So
there you go.
That's how it should work.
That.
But thank you again. This has been a delight and so informative, and I could talk for 7 more hours. So,
Yep.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Anatomy of Us. This podcast is produced by my mom, Melanie Studley, and hosted by my dad, Seth Studley. Our show is edited and published by our producer, Reva Hansen, from Creative Media Support. Special thanks to our Patreon members that get an extra episode every week. Thanks for watching. Love you. Bye.